Flash was one of the biggest box office bombs in studio history. So Warner Brothers did the drastic thing. They blew up the entire universe and they hired James Gunn to build a new one from scratch. 2 years later, that rescue is failing on every metric that matters. The box office and audience retention is terrible. The internal consistency is lacking, and even the studio's own confidence says that it's failing, not struggling. I'm going to walk through exactly why, and we're going to try to use the studio's own numbers to prove it. Let's start with the film everyone points to as proof that the gamble worked, which is Superman 2025. Let's look at the budget, because those numbers are the story that I don't think Warner Brothers really wants us to know about. The official production budget was $225 million. That's the figure Warner Brothers put out. But an Ohio tax filing is a legal document rather than a press release, puts the gross production costs at $363.8 million. That's an $138 million gap. Gunn disputed the Ohio figure publicly, and he argued that that was the net cost after tax credits, and the incentives bring it back down to $225 million. That's an awful lot of tax credit, but those aren't free money anyway. They're subsidies paid by taxpayers, by you. The gross cost of making this film was still $363.8 million, and where that money came from doesn't really change what they spent. Regardless, though, we have two budgets for one movie. One seems to be for the tax man, and one seems to be for the YouTubers. Pick whichever one makes you feel better, because that looks like what they did. If we add marketing, the studio reported $125 million in global marketing costs. The Hollywood Reporter's pre-release estimates suggested that the total spend approached $400 million. So let's call it $350 million as a conservative figure. $400 million, you could have bought every person who went to see this movie a decent dinner and you would still come out ahead on goodwill. Now, let's run the math that they run. The theater chains keep roughly half of every ticket sold. Against the worldwide gross, Warner Brothers took home about $308 million to maybe $320 million in actual studio revenue. That's below the $350 million spent, so on pure theatrical math, they didn't really turn a profit. The studio's own victory lap claimed that they made $125 million in profit, but that depends on the entirely self-reported, unaudited streaming revenue from HBO Max. I think that also includes digital purchase and rental incomes, and maybe some membership partnerships. 2 months after the release, Warner Brothers announced that Superman had broken streaming records. 13 million views in its first 10 seconds. Supposedly the platform's biggest debut since Barbie. It sounds impressive, except nobody has verified any of that. The studio picked the metric and they picked the comparison, and then they release it through their own press office. You're being asked to accept their own accounting of their own success as the definitive number. They graded their own homework, gave themselves an A, and then they put out a press release about how well they were doing in school. But let's look at that digital price collapse. They launched on storefronts, video on demand, $29.99 to buy. Within 6 weeks, that price had fallen to $12.99, and one retailer had it at $9.99 within 2 weeks of launch. A film that's genuinely moving at blockbuster speed doesn't get discounted by more than half the price before its theatrical run is finished. That is a clearance price. $30 to $10 in 2 weeks, that's not a blockbuster, that's an Ollie's bin. Even the reviews, the one place the film unambiguously performed, it looks a little softer than at first glance. Rotten Tomatoes had it in the mid-80s. Metacritic, which scores reviews on a weighted scale instead of sorting them into good or bad, it had it closer to low to mid-70s in the same critical field. Good, but not really the generation-defining masterpiece that the marketing implied. If you put those three together, a production cost that nobody can really be sure about, a streaming record that nobody can verify, and a price that went into the bargain basement bin almost immediately, none of that makes it a disaster, but it does say that the gap between how this film was sold and what the verifiable numbers show is large enough to notice, and it's worth noticing before Supergirl's numbers came in and made the foundation look even shakier. Now, if we set the money aside and just look at the movie, we'll see that the finances aren't the only thing that's wobbly. That Lois interview scene is the film's most praised sequence, and it's also, I think, one of the most revealing ones. Let's look at it. Clark breaks into Lois's apartment. She grabs a baseball bat before realizing it's him, which tells you she never gave him a key. He's made a surprise anniversary dinner, except he's made breakfast for dinner, which he tells her that it's her favorite, but she goes, no, it's your favorite. So he made himself his own favorite meal and presented it as a romantic gesture. That scene barely registers before moving on. This is wildly out of character for Superman. Then comes the interview. Clark expects soft treatment. He doesn't get it. Lois challenges him on whether his military intervention was the right call. He gets flustered and defensive, and he raises his voice at her, and multiple critics pointed to this as a notable event in decades of live-action Superman, because he simply doesn't do that. Then he storms out. The film presents this as a nuanced relationship drama, but let's look closer at this. This is a man who's been operating as both a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and the world's most powerful superhero for years. He carries the knowledge of two civilizations. He is Lex Luthor's cognitive equal without the sociopathy, and he can't hold his own in an argument about whether saving lives was a good idea? Lois doesn't outmaneuver him intellectually. The film needs him to lose, so it writes him in a way that he cannot win. Which leaves us with the smartest man on Earth and the holder of two civilizations worth of knowledge gets rhetorically dismantled and storms off like a butthurt teenager. The deeper choice is the Clark as costume inversion. Gunn's Superman explicitly reframes Clark Kent as the true self and Superman as the persona he puts on, a deliberate reversal of the classic reading where Superman is who he is and Clark is the disguise. That's more than a creative preference. If Clark is the real person and Superman is the mask, then all of Superman's values, his commitment to the truth, his love of justice, his self-sacrifice, they all belong to a persona rather than a person. They become costume pieces rather than convictions. That's a significant thing to do to this character, and the film never really reckons with it, which is why large stretches of his own movie show him uncertain, second-guessed, and talked over rather than commanding. It's great writing for Lois, but it's very diminishing for Superman. Congratulations, you gave Lois Lane the best writing she ever had in 40 years, and you took it directly out of Superman's pocket. Gunn's weak-ass excuse is that he wanted to find humanity in Superman, but Gunn himself rejects the values that make Superman super. Superman's humanity was never new. What's new is the kind of human he's become, and this version doesn't choose to be good despite having no obligation to. He just loses arguments like the rest of us. The classic version was always a godlike being who freely chose human values. What this version gets is human weakness, and that's a different gift to this character. There's a difference between humanizing Superman and diminishing him, and this film keeps mistaking one for the other. Ma and Pa Kent raised him to choose better without forcing him to. Swap that guy for a guy who storms out of an argument, and you've shrunk him. Gunn didn't find the human in Superman, he found the ordinary in him. Before I keep going, one thing worth mentioning about every glowing headline you read about this phenomenal franchise is that the outlets writing them, they aren't really independent. Variety, Deadline, and The Hollywood Reporter, the three biggest names in entertainment journalism, they're all the same guy. It's one company, one owner, Penske Media, run by Jay Penske. It gets more tangled from there. The same corporate structure through a joint venture with billionaire Todd Boehly Eldridge Industries now owns the Golden Globes outright, the actual award show these outlets cover every January. And Boehly, the man who co-owns that entire apparatus, is also the chairman of A24, meaning the people running the award show and the trade press covering them have a financial stake in whose films succeed. So basically he owns the restaurant and the health inspector and the Yelp page. Pretty cozy. So asking Variety to cover a Warner scandal is like asking me to review my own dick pic, which is pretty impressive, if I do say so myself. None of this really proves a conspiracy. It's actually more simple than that. These outlets depend on studio access, embargoed screenings, and that enormous for your consideration ad campaigns every award season. That's real financial incentive toward friendly coverage. Whether anyone's twisting anyone's arm behind the scenes doesn't really matter. So when a headline calls something a historic win or record-breaking debut, that's worth remembering. It's not that they're lying, it's that the version of events most convenient for the studios is also the version that's the easiest to find. And also, sometimes they're lying, allegedly. Let's face it, it's not really hard to break a record when you get to pick which record, when, where, and why. 1 year later brings us to Supergirl, and this was supposed to be the proof that the universe could expand beyond its one recognizable name. Instead, it opened to about $37 million domestically against a $170 million budget and roughly $120 million in marketing, which was already a disappointment before the second weekend arrived. And then what happens next is really juicy. Let's put that on the table. Production budget $170 to $186 million net after incentives. Global marketing and promotional spend approximately $120 million in standard P&A. That's prints and ads, which is what the studio calls marketing. Plus a DC record, remember what I said about records, $100 million in promotional partner campaigns that don't appear anywhere in the standard number. Total investment by any honest accounting is somewhere between $390 and $406 million. Break even, per sources close to the production, we're putting it at approximately $315 million worldwide in ticket sales. Except what they meant was ticket revenue, which requires twice that amount in gross ticket sales. That's the floor for not losing money, well short of the threshold to make a profit. Opening weekend, $37.1 million domestic, $68 million worldwide. The studio had targeted $50 to $55 million domestically, and early tracking pegged it closer to $65. The actual number came well in below both of those. Somewhere there's some analysts that are quietly updating their LinkedIn pages. Second weekend down 74%. In comparison, The Flash dropped 72%, and that became the film that defined catastrophic failure in this genre. Morbius dropped 73%, and it became a punchline. Those two are the low watermarks of the entire genre. Those are the films that killed the DCEU. And Supergirl, under the leadership hired specifically because The Flash was unsalvageable, posted a worse collapse than either of those. Last month when I wrote this, the projected final worldwide gross was $200 to $210 million against a $315 million break-even. And that's their own break-even, which I'm pretty sure is dubious to begin with. But for the sake of argument, we're using their own numbers. And it didn't even come close to that. They ran it out another couple weeks just to break $125 million domestic. Oh, wait, that's worldwide. They were projecting losses around $85 to $125 million before any streaming or ancillary revenue. It ended up being twice that. There's a reporting trick buried in figures like these, and I want to make you aware of it. When a studio says a film needs $300 million to break even, that figure is sometimes quietly referring to net revenue the studio actually keeps, and not the total ticket sales the public sees on a box office chart. Those are two very different numbers. Theaters keep roughly half of what the film grosses, so hitting $300 million in real studio revenue can mean closer to $600 million at the actual box office. When a break-even figure gets reported without specifying which one it means, the number looks a lot more achievable than it really is. This is the Hollywood equivalent of saying up to 60% off. It doesn't really mean anything until you get the specifics. Then the circus starts all over again, because once those numbers came in, the studio's own allies in the press, they didn't blame the script, they didn't blame the reshoots, they didn't blame the marketing. The New York Times pointed to resurgent misogyny amongst what it called a largely male fan base. Entertainment Weekly ran with that same explanation. Maybe it's just me, but I'm thinking when you're saying that your problem is the audience, that's not a very strong sign that your business is about to turn things around. But let's look at the demographics. Opening weekend audience, 59% male, 41% female. Captain Marvel opened to 45% female, Wonder Woman opened to 52%. Supergirl's own target audience, young women, never showed up in the numbers that built either of those films. Whatever sank this movie, it was not an army of misogynists dragging women away from the box office. The people it was made for didn't show up, and the people who did come weren't enough to save it. But there's a word for reflexively attributing the worst possible motives to an entire sex without evidence. The press didn't use that word about themselves, they saved it for the audience. The word is misandry, and it is the opposite of misogyny. Hatred of men instead of hatred of women. Blaming male audiences for a failure that belonged to the film's own intended female audience. The same entertainment press that reaches for misogyny as a first instinct has never once applied that word misandry to itself or to anyone else. Their bullshit is reflex because it wasn't the men who stayed home this time. The numbers are really only half the problem here, though. Let's look at what this movie does to Superman. Clark himself shows up as the timid, worried older cousin. He leaves Kara video messages, essentially nagging her to come home, and her response, which is reflected right in the film's own marketing, is to graffiti his look-up tagline into look out, treating his concern as something that she can roll her eyes at and shrug it off. Some critics read those scenes as sibling warmth, but I would call it something else. The strongest, smartest man on the planet reduced to the role of the dismissed family member that nobody has to listen to. The film opens with Krypto urinating on a newspaper photo of Superman. This is the first thing Gunn's DCU presents in its second film. No hero shot, no establishing moment, just a dog relieving himself on the face of the universe's most important character. If you think that's an accident, I'd like to sell you a bridge. From there, we meet Kara. She's drunk, bar hopping across the universe in a ship decorated with empty cans and dog urine. She's wearing a Blondie t-shirt, getting into fights. The film frames this as punk rock. It's worth asking what it means to introduce Krypton's last survivor, a character who watched her civilization slowly die, who carries that loss as somebody whose primary characteristic is that she's a mess. $200 million, and the first frame is a dog filing an editorial. Somewhere in a marketing meeting, they looked at that and said, yeah, that's the one. A dog pisses on Superman in the very first frame. But honestly, that's the most accurate review of this movie, and the dog did it for free. One scene really crystallizes this problem. Kara's in a bar negotiating for information, and the alien pulls a young girl she's traveling in with closer, implying that she can be used as payment. Kara's response is to challenge him to arm wrestle. She wins, and then she breaks his arm. There's nothing defensive about it. The threat ended the moment she won the match. She breaks his arm anyway, graphically, and the entire bar pulls guns on her. The film plays this as cool. It's a nice character beat. A being with the power to level a city block, casually maiming somebody in a negotiation that was already resolved just for kicks. Now, I'm not unaware that the guy was using small children as currency, so I guess he had it coming, but seeing that that's basically normal for this planet, it makes you wonder why she would even vacation here, or why isn't she going after everybody else? I guess the moral of this story is human trafficking is okay, just don't do it in front of me. Does the entire planet lack any law enforcement mechanism? The fact is the world building just isn't convincing. Even in the wild, untamed American West, which this is obviously based on, there was law, it just sometimes took them a moment to get there. Now let's look at the villain. Creme de la Creme and his all-male brigands are a planet of men, literally only men, who kidnap adolescent girls as unwilling brides to continue their species. Now let's not even look at the logical inconsistency about that. Like what? They would be the same species as the women birthing them, wouldn't they be? They have no characterization beyond this. They don't have any psychology or backstory, and they're given zero motivation beyond what the film needs them to represent, which is white male hedonism and dominance distilled into an unsympathetic target. One critic accurately described them as this. This is a villain built by somebody who's been scrolling ideologically charged social media since 2020. It makes a lot of sense. It's not a character, it's a demographic. Meanwhile, the female space pirates, oh, we have those, but we don't have those. I don't even understand at this point. But the women who commit comparable violence are spared and treated with respect. So it's the identity that determines moral weight, not the actions of the perpetrators. We have a word for that. Several, in fact, but I'll leave you to figure that one out on your own. So that's what we're given here, a planet exclusively of men who must kidnap brides to reproduce, which raises a species-level question the film is magnificently uninterested in answering. I'm not convinced any person in that writer's room has ever been asked a follow-up question in their entire lives. This brings us to the film's central moral argument, which it articulates and then immediately violates. Kara spends a significant portion of the runtime telling a young Ruthie not to seek revenge on the man who murdered her family, because revenge is bad. What in her life experience says that she would know anything about this? She sends Ruthie away from the final confrontation specifically to protect her from the corrupting influence of killing, and then she corrupts herself? I don't understand. Then Kara, alone with Krim, goes well past killing him. She stabs him in the stomach and then the throat using deliberate, repeated force long after the threat is neutralized. More than one detailed content review described this as torture by execution. It's a little cold-blooded and mired in sadism and not the actions I think of when I think of a hero. And besides, did you ever think maybe the guy had really bad childhood trauma? Maybe his sister was kidnapped and he has a very good excuse for his monstrous behavior. The film then continues to frame her as good. The young girl gives a nice little closing speech about wanting to be just like her. This is in contrast to a previous moment in the film where she tells Kara she hopes she is never like her. The word good appears in this film as an instruction, but never an example. Kara is told by her mother, be good. It's the only moral framework she's given, and the film never really defines what being good means. By the time we reach the ending, we've watched her drink her way across the universe, break a man's arm for kicks, tell a child not to seek revenge, and then seek it herself in the most brutal way available. And we're told she's good now. The little girl's closing speech says so. The entire moral instruction of this film is, be good, which coincidentally was the complete moral framework I gave my golden retriever. The rot shows up in the wins too, and it's not just the losses, and you don't really see this on the box office charts. Peacemaker Season 2, critically one of the best reviewed things DC Studios has put out, still lost 40% of its audience between the premiere and the finale. The finale itself is now the lowest rated episode of the entire series. Great reviews and its bleeding audience anyway. Remember what I said about the reviewers and their motives. Clearly, the audience was not aligned this time. That drop wasn't a fluke. The show spent its final stretch servicing the wider universe's plot machinery instead of being the show that people showed up for. And good marks from critics didn't stop anyone from leaving. I'm pretty sure audience subtraction is not the best method by which you build a shared universe. That's 40% of the people that walked out before the end. They didn't cancel or reschedule, they left the room and they didn't come back, the way people usually do at a party when somebody's dad starts talking. It's also a show that tells on itself if you actually watch it. Harcourt is written as a physically dominant and emotionally armored, unable to say I love you, while Peacemaker himself is the one begging, crying, and getting turned down. The show even puts the diagnosis in a psychologist's mouth on screen, describing Harcourt's aggression as, quote, toxic masculinity, unquote, a label pinned to the woman, played completely straight. That's the script telling on itself right there. The show opens with a scene that tells you exactly where the season is headed. Peacemaker gets rejected from the Justice Gang. That open mic gag is actually funny, though. The next scene cuts to Harcourt in a psychiatric evaluation being told that she has a severe case of toxic masculinity. She has, as she puts it, a vagina. The therapist informs her that assuming only men can exhibit toxic masculinity is a bit sexist. She calls him a word that I cannot say on YouTube and then gets escorted out. Here we have the show correctly identifying its own problem in the first episode, and then it spends 7 more episodes doing it anyway. I'm sure it's a clever scene on paper, but in practice, it's the show diagnosing its own lead character with the exact problem that she was written to embody, and then doing nothing with it. Harcourt spends the season unable to say, I love you back to a man who was begging her for it, punching her car dashboard bloody, picking bar fights. She's the textbook illustration of the pathology that she was told she has. And the show's answer to that isn't an arc, it's just more of the same behavior, but they present it as a strength every time. Meanwhile, Peacemaker, who's just been rejected by the Justice Gang, is dismissed by Harcourt. Unable to grieve his family, he escapes through a dimensional portal into a world where his abusive father and dead brother are alive and loving. A Nazi world, as it turns out. I think they call it Earth X. The season's central dramatic engine, such as it is, involves choosing between a warm family and a fascist dimension and a cold reality that doesn't want him. That is an interesting premise, but what the show does with it is 8 episodes of loose threads and a villain who never fully coalesces. The finale was the lowest rated in the show's history, and they had a closing scene that functions as nothing except a setup for Man of Tomorrow. It doesn't conclude anything that actually happened in the show. The audience that came in curious left in droves. The critics gave it 95% and the audience gave it 42%. When the gap's that wide, someone isn't watching the same show or they are not being honest about it. I think here Earth X deserves its own moment because the contradiction here is ridiculous. The whole premise is that it is a world where the Nazis won and their ideology dominates, yet the specific interactions we see don't reflect this at all. The police officer who encounters Peacemaker treats him with more courtesy and procedural restraint than you would expect from law enforcement here. There is no coherent internal logic to what life in that dimension really looks like beyond the surface level of Nazi world. It's the same structural problem running through the villains in Supergirl. The brigands are labeled as a patriarchal oppressor class, but the film never really builds a world around that label, and it doesn't hold together under scrutiny. Earth X gets the same treatment. They name the ideology and they gesture at the aesthetic, but the actual behavior of the people in it doesn't follow from the premise. It's set dressing, not really world building. So we have a Nazi one dimension that's supposed to represent the ultimate expression of fascist ideology, except the cop who encounters Peacemaker there is more procedurally courteous than most law enforcement interactions you'd see in the real world. Nobody in this fascist hellscape behaves like they live in one. The writing doesn't do the work here, so the label has to, because you're basically telling me the Nazis won the war and the first thing they did was implement de-escalation training and a body cam policy. Worst timeline in the multiverse, and the cops are nicer than Chicago. Jennifer Holland, who plays Harcourt, is married to the showrunner and has said publicly that she got an early draft of the script and she had it thrown out and rewritten around exactly this relationship dynamic. That's the same season that hemorrhaged its audience by the finale. Family connections don't stop at his wife. His brother Sean Gunn has landed multiple roles across this universe, including Maxwell Lord, a slick, manipulative con man, and he drew real public backlash from fans arguing he doesn't have the presence for the part. Backlash that James Gunn had to personally respond to. Whether you think of Sean as an actor, he is a journeyman with real credits of his own. It's hard to watch that pattern and not wonder whether these parts get written around who's available in the family rather than who is really right for the role. At some point, this feels like a family reunion with a budget. Then we have the agency itself, Argus. That's the organization this universe's own lore says was built specifically to contain threats like Superman. Think about that. In the same timeline, that agency gets publicly exposed for running an illegal black ops program, and it's staffed by convicted criminals. It gets shut down because of that, immediately starts a new secret one anyway. Its flagship field team spends the season getting fired, drunk, and coked out of their minds. And when Superman actually needs oversight, that disgraced, dysfunctional agency is nowhere to be found. It gets handed straight to a private citizen instead. A universe that wants you to take this agency seriously as a check on a god really needs to explain why it also wants you to laugh at how broken and fucked up everyone in it is. It doesn't do that. Act as a check on Superman, hell, they can't even act as a check on their own drug problem. A shared universe is supposed to have rules, and in 3 years, DC Studios still doesn't have consistent ones. Take Blue Beetle. Gunn called it the first DCU character back in 2023. Then he said the film wasn't actually canon to his continuity. Then he more recently said the character is canon after all, but the studio hasn't confirmed anything concrete. Meanwhile, Peacemaker and Amanda Waller got waved through from the old universe with barely a hiccup. Canon is whatever Gunn says it is, and most recently when he said it, because that keeps changing too. That's a mood swing, not a shared universe. The architect of your universe has to keep publicly re-explaining everything, what's real and what's not. 3 years and they still can't answer which movies count. I know 14-year-olds running a D&D campaign with tighter continuity than that. And then we have Batman, arguably the single most valuable character in the DC library. It's still stalled. No confirmed director, no date. We don't even have a clear plan for folding him into this universe, even as the rest of the slate races forward. However, much of that slate has been canceled since I originally wrote this script, so let's put a pin in that one for now. Behind the scenes, the leadership question is live right now. Gunn and his co-chief Peter Safran signed an original 4-year deal back in 2022 that's since been extended by about 1 more year, time to cover the release of the next Superman film. Right as Warner Bros. Discovery's ownership itself is changing hands, trade reporting this week is openly asking whether Gunn survives past that window. That's exactly what we're asking. You don't extend somebody's contract by a single cautious year if you're fully confident in the multi-decade plan that they're building. 1 year. They renewed the man in charge of a multi-decade plan for 1 year. That's a landlord going month to month because he thinks you might skip town, and meanwhile Batman, the most valuable character in the comics, sits in the garage while everyone takes the bus because nobody can find the keys. The next real test is Lanterns, the Green Lantern series, and its first trailer has already been described as divisive before a single episode is aired. After that comes Clayface, a much smaller, lower-budget swing, which itself tells you something about how much appetite is left for another big bet right now. That's the rescue plan for a billion-dollar franchise. True Detective in space, and a cheap horror movie about a mud guy. Clayface, a low-budget film about a man made of mud. Given the year they had, that may be the most honest branding on the slate. So what actually failed here? We can start with Superman itself. Officially, it cost $225 million in ad marketing and promotion and reported anywhere from $125 to $200 million, and your total investment climbs to as much as $425 million. If you run the standard math, 2.5 times total spend needed in worldwide box office just to break even, that puts the bar somewhere between $850 and $1 billion. It made $618 million. On pure box office, it isn't close, short by roughly $230 million at best, and well over $400 million at worst, depending on which marketing figures you use. The only way this film broke even is by counting self-reported streaming numbers and digital revenue that nobody can verify. On the one number anyone can actually check, worldwide theatrical gross, it didn't work. Then we have a streaming record that nobody can verify and a digital purchase price that collapsed by more than half within 6 weeks of release. Individually, any one of those can be waved away, but together they describe a film that was marketed as a triumph, while the actual checkable numbers tell a much different story. And that's before you get to what came after. A sequel that posted a worse second weekend collapse than the film everyone agreed had sunk the old universe. We can add to that a flagship show that bled 40% of its audience by its own finale despite great reviews, and 3 years of unanswered questions about what's even canon, a stalled Batman, and a leadership operating on a contract that might not survive the year. On the bright side, every one of those promises is self-inflicted, which means at least nobody has to go looking for a culprit. This isn't one rough weekend. The sequels aren't the whole story. It starts with the foundation. 2 years in, this is a franchise that oversold its first win and then failed to build anything on top of it. Unequivocal failure isn't hyperbole here. It's the plain read of the numbers once you actually check them. The only way this even breaks even is if you count the numbers the studio made up, which, to be fair, was probably their plan in the first place. Where would you rank this DCU relaunch against the disasters that came before it? Please check out some of my other videos and do all that stuff that everyone always asks. You know, like, share, and subscribe. It really helps if you leave a comment too. Tell me how wrong I am. Call me an idiot. Call me an istophobe. Get it? That's the end of the video. I'm Istophobos. It's time to leave now. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. Until next time, be seeing ya.